Some people believe miracles arrive with thunder and light, but the quietest ones often begin with a single sound in the dark. The first snowstorm of December swept across the Bitterroot Mountains like a pale curtain drawn over the world. Wind drifted through the pine forests, carrying the scent of ice, cedar, and distant wood smoke. Above the winding mountain road, hidden among towering evergreens and granite cliffs, an old brass bell began to ring. Its voice floated softly through the storm. One note. Then another. Then silence. The bell belonged to Whitmore Mountain Inn, a place so remote that many travelers never knew it existed. Nestled high above the valley, the inn stood alone beneath the falling snow, its warm windows glowing faintly against the darkness. For more than a century, the bell had hung above the entrance, weathering storms, seasons, and generations. Locals often joked that the bell had a mind of its own. On certain nights it rang without wind. On others it remained silent through the strongest gales. No one could explain it. Nearly half a mile down the mountain road, Lucas Bennett guided his aging pickup through the storm. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield in thick waves, illuminated by the truck's headlights before vanishing into the darkness. At 40 years old, Lucas carried the quiet strength of a man who had survived more than he talked about. His broad shoulders filled the faded flannel jacket he wore beneath a heavy canvas coat. Silver touched the edges of his dark brown hair, and years of hard work had carved steady lines around his gray eyes. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose alert amber gaze rarely missed anything. The dog's silver and cream coat gleamed softly whenever the dashboard lights caught it. Ranger had spent years working search and rescue assignments before finding a permanent place beside Lucas. Over time, the bond between them had become something deeper than partnership. Lucas trusted Ranger's instincts almost as much as his own. The heater hummed softly as they climbed higher into the mountains. Outside, snow blanketed every branch and fence post. The world seemed suspended between silence and memory. Then Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood rigid. His nose pressed toward the passenger window. Lucas noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly. Ranger didn't bark. He simply stared into the storm. His muscles tightened beneath his thick coat. A few seconds later, the dog released a low whine. Lucas eased his foot off the accelerator. Experience had taught him never to ignore that sound. The truck rolled forward another 100 yards before Ranger barked once. Sharp. Urgent. Lucas looked ahead. At first he saw nothing but swirling snow. Then a shape appeared near the edge of the road. A small vehicle rested at an awkward angle beside a snowbank. One headlight glowed faintly through the storm. Lucas pulled onto the shoulder and shut off the engine. The mountain seemed to hold its breath. Ranger was already at the door before Lucas reached for the handle. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they moved toward the stranded vehicle. Through the curtain of falling snow, Lucas spotted an elderly woman standing beside the driver's door. Her gray coat was dusted white, and one gloved hand gripped the frame for balance. She looked determined, but the cold had painted her cheeks pale. Relief flickered across her face when she saw them approaching. Above the mountain ridge, far beyond the trees, the old bell rang once more. Sometimes a place remembers people long before people remember the place. The elderly woman offered a grateful smile as snow gathered along the shoulders of her wool coat. "I was beginning to think I might spend the night out here," she said, her voice calm despite the cold. Lucas noticed something steady about her, the kind of composure that comes from a lifetime of guiding others through difficult days. Ranger approached carefully, tail low, amber eyes studying her face. The woman smiled at him immediately. "And you must be the one who sounded the alarm." Ranger sat beside her as though accepting the compliment. A few minutes later, Lucas managed to free the vehicle from the snowbank. The road ahead remained slick, and the storm showed no sign of easing. "You shouldn't be driving up here alone tonight," Lucas said. "Probably not," the woman admitted. But old habits are hard to break. She introduced herself as Margaret Whitmore. The name seemed familiar somehow, though Lucas couldn't place it. When she mentioned the inn at the top of the mountain, he glanced toward the distant ridge where a warm glow flickered through the snowfall. "That's home," she said softly. Together they continued the climb. The forest thickened around them, pine branches bending beneath fresh snow. By the time they reached the inn, the storm had transformed the mountains into a world of silver and white. The building emerged from the darkness slowly, its stone chimney releasing a ribbon of smoke into the night sky. Golden light spilled from tall windows framed by weathered timber. The place felt less like a business and more like a memory that had somehow survived the passage of time. As soon as Lucas stepped onto the porch, he noticed the brass bell hanging above the entrance. Its surface glowed softly beneath the lantern light. The metal appeared polished despite its age. Margaret paused beneath it for a moment. "My grandfather hung that bell over 100 years ago," she said. "It has a habit of surprising people." Before Lucas could respond, Ranger froze. His ears lifted toward the upper floors. The dog stared toward a dark window near the roofline. Snow drifted across the glass, and for a brief second Lucas thought he saw movement behind the curtain. Then it was gone. "Something wrong?" Margaret asked. Lucas looked back toward the window. "Probably nothing." Yet Ranger continued watching. Inside, warmth wrapped around them immediately. The scent of cedar, old books, and fresh coffee filled the air. A stone fireplace crackled in the main lounge, casting golden shadows across worn hardwood floors. Photographs lined the walls. Generations of travelers smiled from black and white frames. Some dated back decades. Others appeared even older. Margaret hung her coat near the door and switched on a brass lamp beside the front desk. The light revealed shelves of antique clocks, maps, and carefully preserved journals. "Not many guests this time of year," she said. "The mountain prefers quiet." "Winters." Lucas nodded as Ranger wandered across the room. The dog stopped near an old staircase leading upward. He sniffed the air once, then twice. Instead of climbing, he sat at the bottom step and stared into the darkness above. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. Then, somewhere on the third floor, a single floorboard creaked. Margaret looked up. Ranger did not move. It was almost as though he had been waiting for the sound. Morning arrived slowly over the mountain, painting the snow-covered pines in shades of silver and pale gold. Lucas woke before sunrise, stirred not by sound but by the unusual stillness that filled the inn. The storm had passed. Through the frosted window beside his room, he could see miles of untouched wilderness stretching toward the valley below. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. Then he noticed Ranger sitting beside the door. The German shepherd was already awake, watching him with patient intensity. The dog led him downstairs where the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the warm air. Margaret stood behind the front desk organizing old guest records. Sunlight streamed through the lobby windows, illuminating countless dust particles that floated like tiny stars. "You sleep well?" she asked. Lucas nodded. "Better than I expected." Margaret smiled and handed him a steaming mug. Before either could continue, the distant sound of engines echoed from somewhere below the mountain. Ranger's ears immediately lifted. Lucas stepped onto the front porch. Far down the winding road, 3 black sport utility vehicles were climbing toward the ridge. Their dark shapes moved slowly against the white landscape. By mid-morning, the vehicles arrived. Several men and women stepped out carrying maps, measuring equipment, and survey markers. They were polite, professionally dressed, and completely out of place among the century-old buildings and snow-covered forests. Lucas watched from a distance while Margaret's expression tightened ever so slightly. A tall man with silver hair approached the porch and removed his gloves. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said warmly. "It is good to see you." Again. Margaret's smile never reached her eyes. Mr. Pierce. The man introduced himself as Douglas Pierce. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to making difficult conversations sound reasonable. He spoke about investment, development, opportunity, and growth. According to him, the entire region stood on the edge of a new future. A world-class resort could bring jobs, visitors, and prosperity to communities that had struggled for decades. Lucas listened carefully. Nothing Douglas said sounded dishonest. In fact, much of it made sense. The mountain towns below were small. Many businesses sat empty. Young people often left and never returned. Yet every time Douglas mentioned purchasing the inn, Margaret's posture grew firmer. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "But my answer has not changed." Douglas sighed gently. "You are protecting a beautiful piece of history. I respect that. But history alone cannot stop time." He handed her a thick envelope before turning toward his vehicle. As he passed Lucas, he paused. "You seem like a practical man," he said. "Take a look around. Decide for yourself whether preserving the past is always the kindest thing to do." Hours later, the survey team disappeared down the mountain. The inn felt strangely quieter afterward. Lucas found himself thinking about Douglas's words. That evening he sat alone in the library studying maps of the valley. Economic reports and development plans filled the envelope. The numbers were impressive. The promises seemed genuine. For the first time, uncertainty entered his mind. Perhaps the future Douglas described would help thousands of people. Perhaps Margaret was holding on to something that could no longer be saved. As twilight settled outside, Ranger suddenly stood. Without making a sound, the dog crossed the room and stopped beside an old bookshelf hidden in the far corner. He stared at a single weathered volume that looked untouched for years. Lucas closed the folder and slowly rose to his feet. Lucas stepped closer to the bookshelf while the last traces of daylight faded beyond the library windows. Ranger remained perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on a narrow blue volume wedged between dozens of weathered books. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first glance. The cover was faded. The spine carried no title. Yet the dog refused to look away. Lucas carefully pulled the book free. A thin layer of dust drifted into the lamplight. The volume felt heavier than it should have. When he opened it, he discovered it was not a book at all. The pages had been hollowed out decades earlier. Hidden inside rested a small brass key attached to a leather tag. Written across the tag in elegant handwriting were 3 simple words, "For the classroom." Lucas stared at the key for several moments. He had never heard Margaret mention any classroom. Before he could examine it further, a voice behind him spoke softly. "I wondered when someone would find that." He turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway. The warm expression she usually carried had disappeared. Her eyes lingered on the key before drifting toward Ranger. The old dog seemed strangely calm now, as though he had completed a task that had taken years. Margaret slowly crossed the room and lowered herself into a chair beside the fireplace. For a long moment she simply watched the flames dance across the stone hearth. "There was a time," she finally said, "when this mountain was full of children." Lucas sat across from her. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the windows. "You taught here?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "For 43 years. A faint smile touched her face. "Many winters ago, families lived all across these ridges. The roads were rough. Snow often blocked travel for weeks. So we created something special." She looked toward the ceiling as if searching for memories hidden among the old beams. "Every Saturday, children would come to the inn. We turned part of the building into a school. Reading, writing, science, history. Some traveled miles through snow just to sit in those rooms." Lucas listened quietly. The picture she painted felt very different from the business battle Douglas Pierce had described. This was not merely an old building. It was a place woven into countless lives. Margaret glanced toward the key still resting in his hand. The classroom closed many years ago. Most people forgot it ever existed. Then why hide the key? Lucas asked. The question lingered between them. Margaret's smile faded. For the first time since meeting her, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Because not everything inside was meant to be found by the wrong people. Before Lucas could ask what she meant, headlights swept briefly across the library windows. Both turned toward the glass. A vehicle was climbing the mountain road. At this hour, there should have been no visitors. The engine sound faded moments later, but neither Lucas nor Margaret moved. Ranger rose from the floor and walked toward the front entrance. His ears stood tall. His posture was alert but not fearful. He seemed to be listening to something beyond the walls of the inn. Then came an unexpected sound. Not from outside. Not from the road. Somewhere deep within the building, far beyond the library, a bell rang once. Soft. Clear. Deliberate. Margaret slowly closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her voice had become almost a whisper. That has not happened in 20 years. The photograph remained on Lucas's desk long after Margaret had gone to bed. Outside, moonlight stretched across the snowfield surrounding the inn, turning the mountain into a landscape of silver and shadow. The face that had been carefully removed from the picture left behind an empty shape that seemed larger than the missing person itself. Ranger lay beside the fireplace, watching the photograph with the same quiet attention he had given the hidden key and the old bookshelf. Lucas had spent years learning that missing pieces often mattered more than the pieces that remained. By morning, he made a decision. He would stop chasing assumptions and start looking for facts. After breakfast, he asked Margaret whether there were any remaining records from the old mountain school. The question caused only the slightest pause, but Lucas noticed it. Margaret folded a dish towel carefully before answering. Most of them are stored in the archive room above the east wing. Her voice remained calm, yet something in her eyes suggested caution. You are welcome to look. That answer surprised him. He had expected resistance. Instead, Margaret handed him a small ring of keys and returned to sorting letters behind the front desk. The archive room occupied a forgotten corner beneath the roofline. Dust covered the shelves. Sunlight filtered through a narrow window overlooking the valley. Boxes filled the room from floor to ceiling. Attendance ledgers. Report cards. Scholarship applications. Decades of lives preserved in paper and ink. Lucas spent hours reading. As the morning passed, a new picture began to emerge. Margaret had not simply taught children. She had built opportunities for them. Many of the scholarship recipients had gone on to become doctors, engineers, business owners, and teachers. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the records. One of them was Douglas Pierce. Every document described him as hardworking, determined, and exceptionally gifted. Yet something else caught Lucas's attention. Near the end of one ledger, an entire section of scholarship records had been removed. Not damaged. Removed. The page numbers skipped forward as though a chapter had been lifted from a book. At that exact moment, Ranger stood. The dog moved toward the far wall and stopped beneath a framed map of the mountain. His nose brushed the lower corner of the frame. Lucas crossed the room and lifted it carefully. Behind the map rested a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Written across the front were the words, "To be opened only if the mountain is at risk." Lucas stared at the envelope without touching it. For the first time, he understood why Margaret seemed burdened whenever the past was mentioned. Whatever this was, she had prepared for it long ago. Before he could decide what to do, movement outside the window caught his eye. A helicopter appeared beyond the ridge. Its distant shape crossed the valley before descending toward a clearing several miles away. Minutes later, his phone vibrated. The message came from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. The State Historical Commission has approved a preliminary review of the property. The sender's name appeared below the message. Douglas Pierce. Lucas read the words twice. Everything changed. In that moment. Until now, the conflict had been about ownership. Suddenly it became something far more complicated. If government investigators arrived, the mountain's secrets might not remain hidden much longer. And for the first time, Lucas began to wonder whether Douglas was trying to uncover the truth or prevent someone else from finding it first. The roar of the helicopter faded as it touched down in the snowy clearing behind the inn. Lucas Bennett did not hesitate for another second. He decisively removed the framed map and took down the sealed envelope bearing the words, "To be opened only if the mountain is at risk." Ranger let out a low growl, his ears pricked up, facing the sound of heavy, hurried footsteps coming up the attic stairs. The wooden door burst open. Douglas Pierce stepped inside, the cold from the melting snow on the shoulders of his expensive coat seeping into the dusty room. The billionaire's gaze swept over the open boxes of records before locking onto the brass key and the envelope in Lucas's hands. "You shouldn't interfere in this, Lucas," Douglas said, his voice stripped of its usual calm, replaced by a heavy pressure. "The State Historical Commission is downstairs. If they find these documents, everything ends." Lucas looked at the gray-haired man in front of him, then held up the sealed envelope. "You didn't call them here to seize this place, did you, Douglas? You want to use the law to seal the inn, turning it into a historical sanctuary to prevent someone else from tearing out the remaining pages of these records." Douglas froze. His shoulders slumped slightly at the veteran's words. Lucas slowly tore open the seal of the envelope. Inside lay not a dark secret, but the missing chapter of the past records, accompanied by a handwritten note from Margaret. "Dear Douglas, the scholarship money back then did not come from any investment fund. It was the life savings of the families on this mountain, pooled together to send their brightest student out into the world. They hid their names because they didn't want you to carry the burden of debt." A profound silence filled the attic room. Stunned, Douglas Pierce accepted the old parchment, his trembling fingers tracing the list of names of the poor mountain folk from decades ago. As it turned out, he had always believed he was completely alone, rising from poverty, thinking this mountain had forgotten him. But the mountain had never forgotten. It had nurtured him with the most silent form of grace. "I thought," Douglas choked up, tears rolling down the stern face of the powerful businessman. "I thought I had to hide this past because I was afraid people would find out I was once a child receiving aid. Margaret and the people here hid it to protect your dignity, not to bury you," Lucas said softly, gently stroking Ranger's head. Downstairs, the inn's brass bell suddenly rang out once more. This time, it was not a single, lonely note, but three cascading chiming tones, clear and warm, echoing through the stillness of the dawning day. Wiping away his tears, Douglas looked out the window where the first light of dawn was casting a silver glow over the pine ridges. He turned to Lucas, his eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "The Historical Commission's review will be cancelled. Instead, the Hayes and Pierce Group will establish an educational preservation foundation named after Margaret Whitmore. This school will open its doors once again." Lucas smiled, threw his backpack over his shoulder, and whistled for Ranger. As they walked out of the inn, the brass bell continued to ring, sounding like a greeting, a thank you,